He stood in front of my paintings with a cigarette in one hand and a smirk on his face. Then, without a word, he lit the edge of my canvas. One by one, he burned them all, every single painting I had worked years to finish. "No daughter of mine paints filth like this," he said. Except I was never his daughter, just a burden to be controlled, silenced, erased. What he didn't know was that I'd spend the next decade turning my pain into power. And when I came back, I didn't just paint again. I exposed him on the biggest stage of his life. Ever been silenced by someone who should have protected you? Drop a if you've ever been betrayed by family. Like, comment, and subscribe, because this is the revenge story you've earned. My name is Sophia, and I was raised in a house where silence was safer than truth. My stepfather, Harold, was a respected academic PhD, tenured professor. The kind of man whose word was treated like gospel. But behind closed doors, he was a tyrant. Cold, manipulative, and obsessed with control. He married my mother when I was 10. She was soft-spoken, grieving, and easy to mold. He made her believe she was lucky to have him. And as for me, I was just the kid who drew too much. By the time I was 16, art had become my only escape. I'd paint until 3 a.m., hiding canvases under my bed. Then one day he found them. He claimed they were disgusting, twisted, and embarrassing. That same night, he dragged them outside and burned them all in front of me and my mother. I left home at 18, with nothing, no savings, no family, and no support. But I had one thing left, the need to prove him wrong. 10 years later, I returned not to make peace, but to turn his carefully polished legacy into ashes, just like he did to mine. My earliest memories of Harold weren't violent. They were worse, calculated. Subtle digs, empty smiles, and an unsettling calm that always made me feel replaceable. My mom married him 2 years after my dad died in a car crash. I was 8. She was still grieving, vulnerable, and desperate to keep our lives from falling apart. Harold came in like a savior, offering to pay off our debt, handle the funeral expenses, and even put my mom through nursing school. At first, I was grateful, until the small things started, like the way he'd never say my name, just her, or how he'd correct me mid-sentence, even when I was just talking about cartoons, or how he accidentally threw away my sketchbooks. Twice. By the time I turned 13, I knew exactly who he was, the kind of man who smiles at you while erasing you. At school, I'd win small art contests. My teachers would pull my mom aside, saying I had talent, real talent. But when we got home, Harold would scoff. "Artists don't pay the bills," he'd mutter. Stop encouraging her delusions. The summer I turned 16 was when things took a turn. I had spent all year secretly working on a personal project, a series of 6 large canvases, inspired by grief, childhood, and memory. I used every spare dollar to buy supplies, even skipped lunches. I planned to apply to an art mentorship program with them. One night I came home from a sleepover, and everything smelled like smoke. My mom was sitting silently on the porch, her eyes red. And Harold, he was in the backyard with an open fire pit. My paintings, everything I had ever created, were gone. Burned. Destroyed. When I screamed, he didn't even flinch. "These were disgusting," he said coldly. "You painted our family like monsters." I had painted my pain, but of course he saw that as an insult. That night something inside me broke, and something else hardened. The years after that were survival. I left home the day I turned 18. No tearful goodbye. My mom didn't stop me. I think, deep down, she wanted me to go. She had learned to live inside Harold's shadow, and there was no room for light in that house. I couch-surfed, worked part-time at a diner, and used library computers to apply for community college. I barely got by, but I kept drawing on napkins on the backs of receipts, whatever I could find. People always talk about making it like it's a moment. For me, it was thousands of tiny steps. Selling a sketch for $30 at a flea market. Getting accepted into a free artist co-op. Pulling my first all-nighter in a studio that wasn't my bedroom. And yet even as I gained small wins, Harold's voice haunted me. Nobody pays for emotions. Grow up. He said that once while tearing up a letter from an art school I'd been accepted into. I learned how to weaponize his words, turn his dismissals into brushstrokes, his control into contrast. I didn't sign my early work with my full name, I went by S. But people started noticing. Exhibits, mentorships, galleries. By 25, I had pieces selling for 4 figures. But I didn't feel free. Not yet. Because the house I grew up in, the one where he burned my soul on canvas, was still his. It had been my mother's. It was supposed to be mine. But after her death 3 years prior, he sold it off to a private buyer and spun a story that I hadn't wanted anything to do with the estate. I had been working at a gallery in Boston when I found out. I remember standing in front of a mural and feeling like the floor fell out beneath me. That house wasn't just walls. It was memory. It was proof. And Harold, he was out there somewhere, still giving lectures on integrity in leadership, receiving honorary degrees, writing memoirs, like he hadn't crushed 2 women's spirits behind closed doors. So, I made a choice. I saved. I planned. I waited. Until one day, an opportunity came. The house was up for sale again quietly, through a contact in my art circle. The current owner was looking to offload it fast after an overseas relocation. I bought it anonymously, renovated it carefully, turned every room into a gallery of shadow and light. My art. My truth. Our truth. The final room, once his office, became an exhibit titled The Scholar's Mask. It was filled with fragments of newspaper clippings, old family photos, and pieces of scorched canvas. And on opening night, I invited critics collectors and his university dean. I wasn't just showing paintings. I was showing a man's truth. And he had no idea it was coming. The night of the gallery opening was a turning point, not just in my career, but in the story I had been writing in silence for a decade. I didn't want revenge to look loud or messy. I wanted it to look beautiful, calculated, timed. I wanted it to sting slowly. The gallery, once our old family home, had been completely transformed. No one could recognize it. The walls, once lined with Harold's leather-bound books, and my mother's faded floral wallpaper, now held raw, powerful expressions of everything we were never allowed to say. The theme of the exhibit was inheritance, but it wasn't about money. It was about emotional scars, what's passed down through silence, cruelty, and control. There was no mention of names, no slander, just truth. Captured in oil, ash, and glass. Critics called it haunting, intimate, devastatingly honest. The final installation, the one in what used to be Harold's study, was deliberately saved for last. It was called the Scholar's Mask, a room lit with dim spotlights. In the center, a melted bronze bust of a man with no mouth. Surrounding it were blackened frames containing burned newspaper articles, altered family photos, and shattered reading glasses embedded in resin. But the piece that caught everyone's eye, an interactive installation where you could listen to clips of academic lectures layered over whispers of a crying woman, static and faint sounds of fire crackling. And that's when Harold walked in. I had invited him through the university, where he still held an honorary board seat. He didn't recognize the sender's name. The email was crafted as a formal invite to a provocative new exhibit on public versus private legacy, something that would flatter his ego. I watched him from across the gallery floor. Older now, but still dressed like prestige-tailored blazer, polished shoes, that same stiff spine. He walked like the world owed him respect, like he owned the room, until he saw the last name on the wall. Mine. Sophia L. Mendez. He froze, tilted his head, then slowly read the title of the installation out loud. The Scholar's Mask, a Daughter's Rebuttal. Our eyes met across the crowd. For the first time in my life, he blinked first. He stepped into the room surrounded by whispers. A few people recognized him, mostly professors, curators, and a few board members from the same university he still represented. I saw confusion on their faces, recognition, then unease. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The art spoke for me, but the moment that pushed it over the edge came from a surprise I hadn't planned. A woman, maybe in her early 60s, stepped forward and gasped as she entered the final room. Her name was Dr. Ellen Voss, a retired professor from Harold's department. I remembered her vaguely from old photos. She had once mentored my mom. She turned to the bust and whispered, This is Harold, isn't it?" Someone asked, "You know him?" She hesitated, then said I knew of him. He was protected, untouchable. Your mother, she tried to report him once, said he was verbally abusive, degrading. Nobody believed her. The room went silent. Even Harold took a step back. That was when the dean, also invited, spoke up. "Sophia, is this all real?" I didn't flinch. I looked him square in the eye and said, "Every piece in this room was created from what he tried to erase. These are my memories. And hers. You decide what's real." Harold opened his mouth to defend himself, but all that came out was a single stammered word: lies. He left the gallery 15 minutes later. Quietly. Avoiding eye contact. The next day, 3 local blogs had published photo essays on the exhibit. Then a student journalist from his university posted a TikTok that went viral. "Y'all, the artist, Sophia Mendez, just exposed her abuser through art. And the man is on our school's board." Over 2 million views in 24 hours. By the end of the week, the university had issued a statement saying it would review its affiliations with former staff after community concerns. He was forced to resign. His publisher dropped him. And I was flooded with messages, not just from fans, but from survivors, from daughters, from women who said, "You painted what I couldn't say." You'd think I'd feel victorious, that I'd feel done. But what I felt was release. Because revenge wasn't about hurting him. It was about finally being seen, about unearthing something buried and letting the world decide what it meant. In the weeks that followed, several more women stepped forward, former students' colleagues. They'd been afraid to speak, but the art made them brave. One message from an anonymous account read, "He told me no one would believe me. But now I believe myself. Thank you." That's when I knew. My revenge didn't end in ashes. It bloomed on canvas. It healed. For a few weeks after the exhibit, everything felt surreal, almost quiet. Too quiet. The news cycles moved on. The gallery remained open by appointment only. The noise faded, and in its place was an eerie stillness I didn't know how to sit with. People called me brave, powerful, a voice for the voiceless. But inside, I was unraveling, because even though I'd exposed Harold, I hadn't spoken to my mother, not in the way I needed, and she wasn't here to answer. I returned to the room that had once been her bedroom. It still smelled like the lavender she used to tuck inside pillowcases. She had died quietly. No fanfare, no hospital, a heart attack in her sleep. I had found out through a legal letter about the estate. She never reached out before she passed. I had told myself for years that it was just her way of surviving, that Harold had isolated her, that she had no power. But now, in this empty house, I started asking the one question I had buried for years. Why didn't she fight for me? Why didn't she stop him from burning my work? Why didn't she speak up, protect me? Why did she let me leave at 18, without a word? And why didn't she tell anyone the truth before she died? The grief hit differently now. Before, it had been anger. But now, it was a grief of what could have been the mother I wanted her to be. The version of her who whispered, "I'm proud of you," instead of staying silent in the kitchen as Harold humiliated me over dinner. I stood in the middle of that room, surrounded by old paintbrushes and worn floorboards. And I broke. I screamed. Not words, just rage. Grief. I threw a vase. Then another. I ripped the corner of a faded photograph. And then I fell to my knees, crying not for Harold, not even for myself, but for her. Because deep down I knew she was a victim too. But her silence didn't just protect her, it damned me. The next morning I found a box in the attic I had never seen before. It was tucked behind old Christmas lights and moldy textbooks, labeled only Sophia for when she's ready. I didn't open it at first. My hands shook just touching the lid. Inside were letters. Dozens. All addressed to me. All written in my mother's handwriting. The first one began, "My Sophia, I don't know when you'll read this. Maybe when I'm gone. Maybe never, but I need to say things. I was too afraid to speak." She spoke about Harold's control, his threats, about how he once told her that if she ever turned Sophia against him, he'd make sure we were both homeless. She wrote about how she used to sneak into my room and read my sketchbooks while I was asleep. She said she knew I had something special, and that she was sorry for not being strong enough to protect it. "You were always light, Sophia, and I let him cover you in shadow. I hope someday you find your way back to your canvas. I hope you find your own brush." By the time I finished reading, the sun was rising, and I was crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child. Not out of rage, but release. Because she had seen me. She had tried. And now I wasn't just painting for me anymore. I was painting for the girl who waited in the hallway every night, hoping her mother would come tuck her in, and for the mother who sat in silence praying for the strength to survive one more day. A week later, the university sent an invitation. They were hosting a panel on women in the arts and academic power dynamics. They wanted me to speak. The panel would be moderated by a woman named Claudia Lynn, a young, sharp professor who had also experienced faculty harassment during her grad years. She told me I read every article about your show. We've never had a woman stand up like that. Not here. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no, because going back, really going back, meant facing that place where Harold had built his throne. But then I remembered that room in my gallery, the melted bust. The silence turned into sound. And my mother's words, "Don't let him have the last word." So, I said yes. The day of the panel arrived. The auditorium was packed students, professors, alumni journalists. I sat backstage watching from the wings. My name printed on the schedule right beneath the title, Art as Resistance One Artist's Reckoning. They introduced me, and I walked up slowly. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. I began not with a statement, but with a question. How many of you have been told your story wasn't real just because it made someone else uncomfortable? Dozens of hands went up, and I smiled. Then I told them everything. Not as gossip, not as vengeance, but as history. My story didn't end with fire. It began with it. And as I stepped off that stage, I realized something powerful. I had always believed that Harold's voice was louder than mine. But the truth was, he just had a microphone. Now, so did I. In the weeks following the panel, I did something I hadn't done in years. I stopped painting. Not out of exhaustion or a burnout, but out of stillness. For once, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. I had spoken. I had been heard. And now I was listening to myself. I spent my mornings walking through the neighborhood around the gallery, sipping slow coffee and watching the seasons change. Autumn was settling in. The leaves curled inward like closing hands, not ending, just resting. For the first time, I gave myself permission to be more than my trauma. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. No name, no return address. Just a simple card. Inside, written in careful handwriting, were just 6 words. You didn't just survive. You transformed. No signature. No clue. But I knew it came from someone who understood. It reminded me of what the whole journey had been about, not just burning bridges, but building new ones. Ones I chose to cross on my own terms. That night I went into the studio space on the 2nd floor of the gallery, once my old bedroom, and sat in front of a blank canvas. I didn't paint. I didn't sketch. I just sat. And I asked myself, if I'm not fighting him anymore, who am I? The answer came in the form of an unexpected visit. It was a Saturday morning. The gallery was closed. I was reorganizing supplies when I heard the soft jingle of the door. I walked out front, annoyed, ready to turn someone away. But then I saw her. Dr. Ellen Voss, the retired professor who had whispered the truth that night during the exhibit. She was holding a small folder and a bouquet of wildflowers. "May I?" she asked gently. I nodded and let her in. She walked slowly through the space, taking in the art again. When she reached the final room, the one dedicated to Harold, she didn't flinch. She simply stood there still and strong. Then she turned to me and said, "I knew your mother. We weren't close friends, but I saw her. I saw her struggle." She handed me the folder. Inside were old faculty notes, memos, and a copy of a written complaint my mother had filed in 2004, buried, ignored, and dismissed by the department. "She tried," Ellen said. "They buried her words. But now your art has unearthed them." I didn't cry. I just nodded. And for the first time I felt like my mother and I were on the same side of history. We sat in the kitchen for an hour, talking. Not about Harold. Not about pain. But about art. About legacy. About the quiet strength women carry when the world won't listen. Before she left, Ellen said something that stayed with me. "You used to create to be heard. Now, you create because you know you already are. That's power. That's freedom." That night, I made a decision. I took down the Harold exhibit. Not because I was erasing anything, but because it had served its purpose. It told the story it needed to tell. And now it was time to make room for something else. The next exhibit was called Inheritance Part 2, The Echo of the Unsaid. It was softer, filled with textures that whispered instead of screamed fabric thread, charcoal dust. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. In the center was a single painting of a young girl sitting at a window holding a paintbrush. Behind her, in translucent layers, was the shadow of a woman placing a hand gently on her shoulder. I named it She Stayed. In the final weeks of the year, a new grant was offered in my name, funded by anonymous donors and supported by the very university that had once honored Harold. It would go to young women pursuing art in the face of adversity. I didn't ask for it, but I accepted it, because this was no longer about Harold, or my mother, or the fire. It was about what I could build from ashes, about giving other girls the brush I once had to fight to hold. And so when a journalist asked me, "What was the moment you knew it was over?" I smiled and said, "It's not over. It's just no longer about him. I am Sophia. Artist. Survivor. Daughtery of the silenced. And now I decide what gets painted. I decide what stays." The day the university publicly severed ties with Harold, the headlines were swift and brutal. Board member resigns. Amid allegations. Sparked by viral art. Exhibit. Celebrated scholars past. Under fire. Artist daughter breaks silence. He had spent decades building an empire of respect, but it only took one exhibit to unravel the lies he built it on. Within a month, his upcoming book tour was canceled. His honorary degrees were quietly revoked. Academic journals pulled his contributions pending ethics reviews, and students, his own former protégés, began to question everything he had ever taught. I didn't have to say a single word to the press. The art had already screamed loud enough. But what hit him hardest was losing control, because for the first time he couldn't control the narrative. Meanwhile, my gallery gained international attention. New exhibitions were booked months in advance. Artists reached out with their own stories. Survivors flew in from across the country just to walk through the space that once belonged to him and now told our truth. One woman stopped me and said I was told for years I was overreacting. Then I walked into your gallery and realized I was underreacting. But the final blow came in the form of a letter, delivered to Harold, signed by his own alma mater. Due to recent revelations, your honorary doctorate is hereby rescinded. We regret the oversight in character. Effective immediately. For a man who measured his worth in titles, prestige, and power, this was public execution by paper. I didn't watch his interviews. I didn't read his statements. He tried to deny everything, to paint me as bitter and unstable. But the world had seen the real story, not in courtrooms, in canvases, in curated silence, in truth. Justice didn't come through fire this time. It came through exposure, through a daughter who dared to paint what others wanted erased. And when the dust settled, only one legacy remained standing. Mine. I don't live in fear anymore. Not of being silenced. Not of being misunderstood. And definitely not of the man who once tried to define me. The house is no longer a monument to my pain. It's a gallery of growth. A sanctuary for truth. A home built not on shame, but on self-worth. Some nights I still hear echoes his voice, her silence my own younger self trying to make sense of it all. But those echoes don't hurt me anymore. Now they remind me of how far I've come. Because healing isn't loud. It's quiet. It's waking up without fear. It's drawing without asking permission. It's knowing your story is yours, and no one gets to rewrite it but you. So, if you've ever been made to feel small, ashamed, or invisible, let this be your sign. You are not what they said you were. You are art in motion. You are worthy of peace, and you don't need to burn to be seen. If this story touched something inside you, drop a comment. Share your truth, or just say, I'm here. You're not alone. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak what others won't.